December 17, 1950, a United States Air Force F-86 Sabre, flying on patrol over Korean airspace, observed in the sky below the swept wing silhouette of a Model 15 MiG. The Sabre's pilot dived on the oncoming target and then positioned himself behind the Soviet-built aircraft. The MiG weaved to avoid the American pilot's aim and for a moment appeared to elude its predator. However, it took only a few minutes for the American pilot to position himself for the shot, and in the space of seconds, the struggle for air superiority over Korea, with the prestige of two opposing philosophies at stake, had begun. The history of jet-powered fighters actually goes back to before the Second World War. The first Allied jet fighter to enter service was the British Gloucester Meteor. Using two centrifugal flow engines, the Meteor was to lift fighter speeds from the previous 400 mile/hour maximum to around 500. These Meteors are based in Europe just before the end of the Second World War. They're obviously of great interest to the American airmen, as the United States Air Force did not have an equivalent in service at the time. In fact, the Meteor saw very little combat, in the main being kept in England for fear that the new technology would fall into enemy hands. It was, however, vitally useful for shooting down the V-1 weapon fired against Britain, a role where its great speed had a major advantage. The British fear that the Meteor should fall into German hands was something of a paradox, because Germany was, at very least, 1 year ahead of British jet design and actually flew jet-powered aircraft before the war. Here, a young German pilot is given some last-minute advice before his first jet flight. Without doubt, the Luftwaffe's most stunning success was this plane, the Messerschmitt 262, an excellent aircraft powered by two axial flow jet engines, which actually made it faster than the Meteor. Also, it employed a successful aerodynamic shape, and later models were intended to utilize a swept wing philosophy which German engineers were at the time developing. Over 1,500 262s were actually built, but on Hitler's personal insistence, many of them were committed to a bomber role, in which the Swallow, as it became known, was by no means best utilized. Later, and at first unofficially, German High Command allowed the 262 to be used as a fighter. In the short time that it was used in the fighter role, the 262's devastating speed caused havoc amongst Allied bombers. Unfortunately for the Germans, the 262 came just too late to save the Third Reich, but it did give the Allies another insight as to the possibilities of jet development. Concentrating more on improving piston engine design, America did not start developing jet technology until 1943. But had the war continued, the excellent Lockheed Shooting Star would have been its first combat jet. This is a photo reconnaissance version, but the basic fighter, which saw service for many years, was very much the same. The Republic Thunderjet offered still further improvement, with a slender, streamlined fuselage and more powerful jet engines. But both the P-80 and the P-84 used the straight wing design, which really was very little different from the shapes employed in World War II. The North American Aviation Company also adopted a conventional straight wing layout for its first jet, but they gained access to the data on German swept wing technology immediately after the war, and as a result modified the wing and tailplane position into a swept back format. The P-86 Sabre, as it became known, was ultimately also to incorporate many other advanced features, like the all-moving tailplane, automatic slats on the wing, and powered air brakes. But most important of all its features were the swept surfaces, which enabled higher speeds to be obtained by reducing air resistance. At the heart of the P-86 was a General Electric J47 jet engine, which utilized the axial flow principle, like that used in the earlier German Me-262, but now more sophisticated and refined. The jet concept worked on the principle of air being drawn in from the air intake on the nose of the aircraft, then passed into an axial flow compressor area, where the air is progressively compressed through 12 different stages. It is then forced into the combustion chambers, where atomized fuel is injected and the mixture is then ignited. The resulting combustion and expansion of exhaust gases provides the thrust necessary and also drives the compressor so that the cycle continues. The thrust produced by the jet engine technology was something that ground crew also had to come to terms with. No-go areas were declared, in front of the engine intake for fear that personnel would be sucked in, and at the rear of the jets because of the phenomenal blast. One problem all jet engines had against piston aircraft was that they consumed vast quantities of fuel. And in a small area such as a fighter's fuselage, every square inch of available space is dedicated to this all-important commodity. The Sabre, like many other fighters, also employed drop tanks to provide extra kerosene. Most Sabres to go into production employed 6 50mm machine guns as the standard armament, and these were mounted on each side of the heavily armoured pilot's position. On 1st of October 1947, the first prototype Sabre, designated XP-86, was ready for takeoff, its clean fuselage with swept surfaces providing a very streamlined image. The one-piece bubble canopy also offered fighter pilots the important facility of excellent vision. Here, number 597, the first completed aircraft, which was to utilize the earlier J-35 engine, takes to the air from Muroc. At the controls is George Welsh. Welsh was based in Hawaii at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and, flying a P-40, he was one of the few pilots actually to get into the air to retaliate. He had the distinction of shooting down the first Japanese aircraft in the Second World War, and he later became a test pilot and worked throughout the F-86 test program. This is not the actual first flight of the Sabre. However, it is interesting that the gear is down all the time, because on the original flight the gear was retracted and there was great difficulty lowering the nose wheel on the approach. So Welsh brought the aircraft in nose high, and the impact of the main wheels bumped the nose gear into place. Production of the Sabre was planned long before the prototype's first flight. Mainly because of the advantages of the swept wing at high speed, the Sabre went into production on 16th of October 1947, with an initial order of 33 F-86A and 190 F-86Bs, which was changed to F-86As later on. From the moment a pilot pushed the external switch to operate the powered canopy, he was stepping into a new world. Once inside, he would first check the ejector seat locking pins. These could not be removed until shortly before taxiing, to prevent accidental firing while the plane was still on the ground. The pilot would then take stock of the staggering array of controls and instrumentation integral to the new technology. The management of a Sabre was a far more complicated business than just the stick and rudder techniques required of pilots of earlier planes. Here, 5,200 pounds of thrust had to be controlled and directed to propel what at the time was the world's fastest fighter.
George Tower, this is Air Force 184 requesting taxi clearance, over.
Air Force 184, this is George Tower. Traffic southwest, cleared to runway 21 right.
One difference between jet-powered and piston engines is that it takes some time to build up the necessary thrust to get the aircraft off the ground. This was particularly so for the heavier jet bombers, but even fighters had to build up their thrust before takeoff. If you look carefully on this shot, you can see the automatic leading edge flaps open, which would give the pilot more control at low speed. In every way, a Sabre was a fighter pilot's aircraft, and its nimbleness and agility were to pay dividends in the years to follow. At this time, the Air Force's designation P for pursuit was replaced by the more apt F for fighter, and the Sabre became the F-86. During the late 40s and early 50s, the Air Force gave many public displays demonstrating the Sabre's performance. And sometimes as many as 80 aircraft would fly in complicated formations, demonstrating aerial skills. The breaking of the sound barrier was still a novelty, and although by then it was a routine for the pilots, at these air shows it was a highlight of the day for the crowds. Public confidence in American air power was vital because in 1949 the Soviets demonstrated a lethal combination. Russia had copied the American B-29 long-range bombers, which could, on a one-way mission, reach the US. Worse, they had successfully detonated an atomic bomb, and America had lost its nuclear monopoly. This, coupled with a rapid deterioration in the relationship between the two nations, was a source of major concern. Sabre production was increased, and an all-weather variant was developed to counter possible Russian attack. This was the F-86D Sabre Dog. The aircraft utilized a sophisticated radar scanner mounted over the nose to locate enemy bombers in all weather conditions and even at night. It also used a rack of unguided rockets mounted in the fuselage, as these were considered a much more effective armament against attacking Russian bombers. When conflict did come, it was actually in a far distant place. North Korean troops invading South Korea caused the United Nations to intercede, and US B-29s were rapidly deployed to the region to destroy northern factories and communications. In actual fact, the B-29 was not the most suitable weapon for this work, but nevertheless it did the job quite effectively, as the US virtually controlled the skies over Korea. Then, on the 1st of November 1950, American pilots were stunned to see the first Russian-built MiG-15s. These aircraft were way ahead of anything the Soviets were thought to have developed, and B-29s, even with their defensive armament, were no match for these brilliant, stubby Soviet fighters. To counter the threat, the Pentagon ordered F-86s to be sent to Korea, and thus began the MiG versus Sabre contest.
The first 4 flights into the area will stay below the contrails and keep a close watch on the fighter bombers. The last 2 flights will go above the contrails and check very closely for any MiG aircraft that might come in above the cons. Now, if you see MiGs up there today, call them out. Give their altitude, direction, and geographical location on the map. And call it out and then get off the radio. Now remember, once you look around, keep your speed up, and if you do get a bounce, cut him off and drive in range. When you get in range, shoot, and when you shoot, shoot to kill. Anybody got any questions? Okay, let's go get him.
After briefing, each pilot would methodically check his aircraft, knowing that his life would hinge upon its efficiency as well as his skill. Usually, Sabre forces were flown in groups of 4 aircraft.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple bogeys out there with one coming around at 2 level. Roger, boy, I got up. He's going down. You got him? All right, boy, that's a good deal. Watch it. We got 4 of them coming in here on us at 7 o'clock. Hang on. Roger, Reed, we got 2 down here, boys, at 3 o'clock position. I haven't done it, go ahead, take it, and I'll cover you. All right, I'm going in now. Okay, you're clear. Go ahead, go ahead. Roger, I'm clear. We're going to start firing now. You're still clear. All right, still got them tips off of him. Okay, he's down, boy. You got him too.
By 1952, US pilots had been exposed to MiG-15s on many successful sorties. And as with the Second World War, an elite of aces appeared, men who had the skill and determination to maximize the ability of their fighters against the enemy. One of the US aces was Colonel Gabreski. Gabreski came to Korea already an ace after flying Thunderbolts during the Second World War, but his reputation was to be enhanced even further as a MiG killer. The skill and experience of the American pilots was vital, because the MiG itself was by no means a poor plane. Although MiG kills were much higher than Sabre losses, there's no doubt that the MiG-15 was a brilliant aircraft and in several ways was superior to the Sabre. Because of this, the Air Force was very keen to lay their hands on a 15 to find out what made it work. And in the later stages of the conflict, dropped leaflets over enemy territory offering enemy pilots $100,000 if they defected with their plane to the south. One pilot, Lieutenant Rowe, took up the offer, and it must have been a very surprised ground crew indeed that saw a MiG-15 land at Kimpo on September the 21st, 1953. The plane was soon in the hands of American pilots, eager to fly the MiG to assess it for themselves. One of the main attributes of the MiG was its armament, which consisted of one 37mm and two 23mm cannon, mounted in a compact demountable unit, which could be quickly replaced by ground crew, enabling the aircraft a very fast turnaround. The borrowed MiG, as it became known, was obtained complete with ammunition, and therefore it was possible to test its firing power. Aircraft carrying heavy cannon have a slower rate of fire than the 6 machine guns of the Sabre, but the hitting power of the cannon was much greater. The MiG's armament encouraged the US to develop a combination of 4 20mm cannon for the Sabre to replace the 6 50mm machine guns. Although it arrived late in the Korean conflict, the cannon-equipped Sabre actually had several MiG kills. But for most of the campaign, it was the machine guns, with their high rate of fire, that would bring down the MiGs. To maximize opportunities, pilots were taught not to approach the enemy directly from behind, but slightly from the side, an angle which offered a bigger fuselage surface to hit. With the excellence of the MiG's design and the power of its arms, the F-86s did not have things all their own way. However, the excellence of the original Sabre design and its sturdy airframe held it in good stead. Many aircraft returned home bearing the results of incredible damage and yet still flying, a tremendous credit to North America's craftsmanship. One of the strengths of the Sabre was the heavy armour provided for the pilots, and this brought back many men who would otherwise not have made it. As the Korean conflict proceeded, American aces were sent back to train new pilots in the ways of the 86 in combat. This policy of experienced pilots passing on their skills to younger men was the other half of the American formula which won the Korean air conflict. Because the MiG was so evenly matched with the Sabre in its overall ability, in the hands of better pilots, the conflict may have had another outcome. It was the greater competence and better training of the American pilots with their consequent greater skill that was the real margin between the two planes. For the pilot, suiting up was no easy matter. Firstly, he would be wearing a heavy flight suit, plus a lined vest and the obligatory .45 automatic. He also had to don a Mae West life preserver, the essential parachute, and a survival kit which contained everything from a rubber raft to a homing beacon. By the time he was sitting in his Sabre, complete with helmet and oxygen mask, he must have felt almost an integral part of the plane. To some extent, this was symbolic. because it was the bonding of man and machine that made the US fighters so effective during the Korean campaign. The Sabre's design allowed for considerable flexibility in its use. While it was essentially designed as an interceptor, it could be equipped with air-to-ground rockets or even to carry bombs. This made it ideally suited to the interdiction role, and even though it was rarely used in this way in Korea, other countries in other theatres employed the 86 very successfully as ground attack aircraft. In the middle 50s, just too late for the Korean conflict, the US developed air-to-air homing missiles, such as the ingenious Sidewinder, and these were fitted to Sabres to increase their interceptor ability. Here, a standard 5-inch unguided rocket is being fired from one side of an 86 to act as a test target to the Sidewinder, fired from the other side. Sabre was also built in Canada and Australia and assembled in Italy and Japan. But perhaps the most interesting development was from Australia. The Royal Australian Air Force had a requirement for an upgraded Sabre, and the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory totally redesigned, strengthened and lengthened the fuselage of the 86 to incorporate the same Avon engine that powered its Canberra bombers. This provided an engine with 50% more thrust than the early Sabre, although incorporating the larger engine was no easy task. The Australian Sabre was the most powerful produced, and although its maximum speed was not that much greater than the American version, it had much higher acceleration and lifting capability. The large letter P on the side of this plane is the standard Commonwealth symbol for prototype, similar to the Y used by American aircraft. Australia produced 112 Avon-powered Sabres, a number of which were given to the Indonesian Air Force as they were superseded by the French Mirage. By the early 1960s, the Sabre, still in service with many different countries, was starting to age. Though the use of Sidewinder missiles enhanced its hitting power as an interceptor, no aircraft, not even the fabled 86, could stay in frontline service forever. And besides, North American had produced a successor in the form of the F-100 Super Sabre. Larger and with speeds of up to 1,000 miles per hour, this, the first of the famous Century series of American fighter aircraft, is shown here next to an F-86 Sabre Dog. In the early 60s, the Sabres were progressively transferred to the Home Guard. Here, a pilot inspects an 86 which has been relegated to the Home Guard use. Again, the combination of man and aircraft is totally effective. The skills and experience of a combat veteran are not lost to the nation, and neither is the investment that it originally made in such a well-built and long-serving aircraft as the 86. For many years after it was replaced in frontline service, the Sabre, in the hands of the Home Guard's skilled and dedicated aircrew, provided a second line of defence. The F-86 was flown by US National Guard squadrons into the 70s and is still being flown by air forces around the world. The design, that traces its way back to the 1940s, has proved extremely durable, not only because the Sabre was well built, but because it did its job.